Hello, this is Dr. Morris. I'd like to do a review of the Exam 1 material for Anatomy and Physiology 1 and Anatomy and Physiology 1, the lab. This course is BSc 2085, BSc 2085L. The section number is .050 for both courses. In preparation of Exam 1, I've already posted an announcement on Blackboard, so hopefully you've read chapters 1 through 3. You've done the review questions that were posted under course documents, and there are also some exercises under course compass that I've asked you to complete. That being said, let me go over some material that's associated with the exam. Now, obviously, those other exercises that I've just addressed will be important in helping you study. However, I do want to emphasize the fact that the course document material and the review questions are where I take the actual exam questions from. The material I go over now is basically covers that same material. Now, in your reading assignments, you notice that there was an overview of each of the organ systems of the human body. There was an overview of the digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system, lymphatic, and endocrine system. I would expect you to be able to give me a brief description, or at least recognize a brief description of each of those organ systems. You should also be able to give me the basic organs that are involved in each of those systems. I'll give you an example. For the respiratory system, I would expect you to recognize that the respiratory system is composed of the trachea, the bronchial tubes, and the lungs. For the digestive system, I would expect you to recognize the esophagus, recognize the stomach, recognize the small intestine and the large intestine. These are just the basic organs that are involved in each of those organ systems. And again, you can go through each of the organ systems that I stated earlier: digestive, respiratory, urinary, lymphatic, and the endocrine system. And again, I would expect you to be able to identify the purpose and function of those systems and the basic organ structures that are associated with them. I also would expect you to recognize anatomical position. There is an illustration in your textbook that has the body in the anatomical position. You should be able to recognize a description of the anatomical position. Also, your book makes mention of various types of positions of the body: the prone position, the supine position. You should be able to clearly recognize or define those positions. There's also a section in your textbook that describes various planes of the body. And when I refer to planes, some of them include the sagittal plane, the transverse plane, the coronal plane, or the frontal plane. These are planes that transect the body. Many of these planes are used in radiographic studies, such as in a CAT scan, a CT scan, which actually slices the body into transverse sections. The sagittal plane, which actually transects the body into right and left halves. I would expect you to be able to recognize these planes, and as a portion of your lab exam, I actually put up some radiographic studies, not for you to recognize specific organs or structures, but basically for you to be able to tell me what plane is that picture taken in. So please review that. I'll review that again when I go over the lab portion of the course. I believe also under your review questions on the lab portion of the course, there is an illustration there. I know there's an illustration in your textbook as well, which actually uses these planes to divide the body. You should also recognize some of the cavities of the body. Again, in your textbook and in your reading, there is a description of various cavities in the body: the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity. There's also a space that separates the pleural cavity. It's referred to as the mediastinum. You should recognize which organ systems are in each of these spaces, these cavities, and be able to identify that for the purpose of the exam. You should also know about the concept of negative feedback. Now, negative feedback is an important regulatory system within the body, and it helps to regulate various aspects of the body's metabolism. You should be familiar with the negative feedback loop and should be able to give me some examples of the negative feedback loop in the human body. You should be able to recognize other aspects of regional anatomy. For example, when I use the term cephalic, what does that refer to? When I use the term gluteal, what does that refer to? You should also be able to recognize various body positions, inferior versus superior, caudal versus cranial, anterior versus posterior. Uh, know what the term medial means. Know what the term proximal and distal mean. These terms are important to know now, and we'll use those later in your studies of anatomy. You should also be able to identify for me the various organs that are located in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, let's start with the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is divided into quadrants. Also in your textbook, the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, and right lower quadrant are divided in an illustration, and it demonstrates the various organ systems that are in each of those quadrants of the abdomen. The pelvic region is communicates with the abdominal region, but it's exclusively different and also has organs in that cavity as well. And I would expect you to recognize that. Let me also go back over the positions of the body when I use the terms distal and proximal. You should understand what is meant by that, and let me give you an example just to be clear. The wrist, for example, is distal to the shoulder. The knee is proximal to the area of the foot. So learn the terms distal, proximal, medial, lateral, and then be able to relate those with various positions or anatomical locations in the human body. There's also some other terms that are be important for you to recognize as a part of the exam. These have to do with the anatomical structures related to the pleural cavity and the lungs. There are the structure of the pleural cavity is described in your book, and you should be familiar with that. You should be familiar with the muscle structure, the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a large muscle that sits actually under the inferior aspect of both of the lungs, and it's an important muscle which is used in respiration. You should be able to give me the anatomical locations of some of the organs in the abdomen. I've already referred to the quadrants of the abdomen, and that's very important for you to go over and recognize where the organs are. You should be able to give me specifically the anatomical location of the kidneys. You should specifically be able to give me the anatomical location of the spleen, the anatomical location of the liver. Also, your book describes some various imaging techniques that are important to recognize as well. It also gives you some illustrations of pictures based upon these different radiographic techniques or imaging techniques. You should be familiar with the use of the ultrasound and exactly what is involved in doing an ultrasound, the CAT scan, and the MRI. Also, some basic chemistry was described in your studies as well, in your textbook and also in the course document presentations. There are various atoms in the body that are important. Remember, the atoms in the body that are most important are those atoms that can react with other atoms, forming molecules. There is a concept by which there is charged particles located within the nucleus and also charged particles located on the outer shell of the atom. I would expect you to recognize the importance of these charges. You should know what the charges are inside the nucleus, and you should know what the charges are, or what the charge is that surrounds the nucleus in the outer shell. There was also a description of how these charges in the outer shell are arranged. You should be familiar with that concept as well. Now, these charged particles will be important later on in your studies, because again, it's the charged particles in the human body that help carry out the reactions that occur in the metabolic operations of the human body. You should be familiar with the definition of a dehydration reaction. You should be familiar with the concept of surface tension. You should be familiar with two terms that are described, especially when we talk about the cell membrane, the term hydrophobic and the term hydrophilic. Um, you should be familiar with the chemical structure for carbohydrates, what atoms are a part of carbohydrates. Similarly, you should be familiar with the chemical structure of lipids, and you should also be familiar with the chemical structure of proteins. Now, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins are very important building blocks in the human body. These are structures or molecules that will be extremely important throughout your studies, and so it's very important that you understand the basic chemical structure of these. You should also recognize what is the most important metabolic fuel in the human body. And then as we talk about proteins, remember protein structures can vary. There are alpha helix, which is a structure I would expect you to be able to recognize a description of the alpha helix and even recognize the alpha helix. Also, proteins can exist in pleated sheets. Structures include primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures of proteins, so I would expect you to be able to recognize these various structures. You should be able to give me the definition of ionic bond, an ionic bond, a hydrogen bond, what is meant by the term covalent bond. And again, these are basic concepts that were described in your reading. You should know what a radioisotope is, what's the importance of a radioisotope, and chemically be able to describe the structure of a radioisotope. Two other reactions that are important for you to be able to identify is a exergonic reaction and an endergonic reaction. Should be able to give me a good definition of both of those, or at least recognize a good definition of both of those, and maybe even give me an example of that type of a reaction. Also in your reading was a description of nucleic acids, and also a definition of genes. As you recall, genes in your reading is a functional unit of DNA, and you should be able to recognize a definition of a gene, exactly how genes are structured. You should be able to differentiate between the cell membrane and a cell wall. Now, your book goes into a detailed description of the cell membrane. Remember, the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. The cell membrane not only surrounds, or I should say the cell membrane surrounds our cells, but also remember some of the organelles, some of the tiny structures within inside the cell itself also have a lipid membrane as well. Now, it's not a phospholipid bilayer, but it is a lipid membrane that surrounds some of the organelles. Thus, the organelles are divided into membranous organelles and non-membranous organelles, and I would expect you to know which organelles are membranous and which organelles are non-membranous. You should be able to give me a complete description of the phospholipid bilayer, understanding which is the hydrophobic end, which is the hydrophilic end, why is the cell membrane constructed like this, what is the importance of the cell membrane in establishing the environment inside the cell versus the environment outside the cell. Now, because of the arrangement of the cell membrane, remember substances are not free to move in and out of the cell. There are mechanisms in place where substances can move in and out of the cell, but it's not a free system. And because of that, I would expect you to also understand some of the ways that substances can move in and out of cells. You should know the concept of active transport and passive transport. You should know what's meant by the term facilitated transport. You should be able to give me a good definition of diffusion and a good definition of osmosis, and certainly be able to recognize those definitions. Also, the organelles that exist inside the cell. I would also expect you to be able to identify and describe the function of each of the organelles inside the cell. Those structures are, for example, lysosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the nucleus, the nucleolus, the mitochondria. These are just some examples of structures I would expect you to be able to recognize. You should be able to tell me the role of centrioles, why centrioles are important in cells. You should be able to tell me a clear function of the mitochondria. You should be able to tell me about some of the surface appendages that we see on cells. I think your book gives an illustration of, an atypical cell which has both cilia and microvilli. These structures are described in your text and your reading. You should be able to tell me the function of cilia and microvilli. These are surface appendages that we see in the cell. I believe I already mentioned it, but if I didn't, facilitated diffusion. I know I talked about diffusion itself, that you should be able to recognize that definition. But also there's a process called facilitated diffusion that you should also be able to describe to me, or at least be able to recognize a description of it. There are also two concepts that are important for you to be able to differentiate. So you should compare and contrast the definitions of mitosis and meiosis. There are similarities, however, they are exclusively different, and you should be able to identify those for me as well. Now, as we talk about the process of transferring genetic information from one cell to another, brings up some other concepts and some definitions that you should be familiar with. One is the definition of transcription, and you should understand a basic concept of transcription and what's involved. There's also replication and translation, two other important definitions that are important in this process that you should be able to recognize. Let's see. Again, as I talked about the basic description of each of the systems, I did not mention the integumentary system. The integumentary system involves the skin, and we're going to go into a lot more detail about that, I believe, in the next material that you study for the exam. But you should have a basic concept of the integumentary system, its role and function in the body as well. Also remember, the integumentary system has a number of surface appendages that you need to be familiar with. There is also a term referred to as homeostasis. Homeostasis. You should be very familiar with this definition and what it refers to and what it means. There's also the concept of acid-base balance. And your book gives a nice description, basic definition of the pH system, why it's important. You should know the normal pH for the human body, and you should be able to describe the basic concepts of acid and bases and why that's important in the body. Understand what ion is specifically related to acid-base balance. You should be able to give me a brief description, or at least know the chemical structure of oxygen, which is a very important, excuse me, which is a very important molecule in the human body. You should be able to at least give me a brief description, or be able to identify sodium, potassium, which are very important electrolytes in the body as well. Which brings up yet a different definition, the definition of electrolytes. You should be familiar with that definition and their importance. When we talk about lipids, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, lipids are produced in nearly every tissue of the body, and that's important. There are a number of various lipids within the body that you should be familiar with, and I would expect you to recognize. Many of those are involved in the cell membrane. Phospholipids, as I mentioned earlier, glycolipids, prostaglandins, steroids. These are all important lipid structures, regulatory structures within the body, and you should be able to recognize those and their importance. You should be able to define the difference between cations and anions. Cations and anions. I believe I already mentioned electrolytes in the body. And that basically covers the material that will be on the lecture portion of the exam. Now, there will also be material that will be covered on the lab portion of the exam, and I'm going to just put up just a little presentation here just to show you the information that I'd like for you to be able to recognize as a portion of the laboratory portion of the exam. Now, I've already discussed this in the review of the lecture material, but when we talk about anatomical planes, I'm showing you now the illustration that is on your PowerPoint presentation of the lab portion of the course. You can see that the human body in this illustration is divided into several planes. And these are the planes that I would expect you to be able to recognize. You can see the sagittal plane that cuts the body into left and right halves. Many of your x-ray studies, sagittal planes are used to make x-ray pictures, and so you're actually looking at sagittal cuts. The transverse plane, as I mentioned earlier for CAT scans, cuts the body into upper and lower portions and basically slices the body as if you slice an orange or slice a tomato. And so anatomical structures are looked at or visualized based upon these transverse planes or transverse slices. There's also the coronal plane, which literally divides the body into front and back halves, or I guess I should say anterior and posterior halves of the body. But you should be able to recognize these anatomical planes, and I will give you some examples, imaging studies that divide the body into these planes. And again, I'm not going to ask you to identify necessarily organ structures, but I would ask you, what plane is this picture taken in? I may even ask you, again, not what the exact structures are, but I may ask you which structure is anterior, which structure is posterior, which structure is more medial, which structure is more lateral. So you should be able to recognize those aspects of regional anatomy. There will also be pictures that will identify the human cell. As you can see from the picture in front of you now, there is a human cell. Now, I don't have a magnification on this presentation, but I'm showing you the cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer. Your textbook has some pictures that show an incredible magnification of this phospholipid bilayer. I would expect you to recognize the hydrophobic and hydrophilic end, what the structures are that make up that cell membrane. Also, when you look at the cell itself, inside the cell, you see there are a number of organelles. I would expect you to be able to recognize these structures: the nucleus, the nucleolus, the endoplasmic reticulum, both the rough endoplasmic reticulum, identified by the small little ribosomes that are attached to it, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. I would also expect you to be able to tell me the function of these organelles. And in fact, the question may read, identify structure related to lipid and carbohydrate synthesis. I may ask you, identify the structure that's related to protein synthesis. Identify a structure responsible for the production of ATP in the body. And so identify these structures, but you should also know the function related to the structures. So again, nucleus, nucleolus, endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, the Golgi apparatus. There are also lysosomes here, but when I tell you I'll put an arrow on those particular structures, I'll give you a definition or a structure to identify, and you'll click on the appropriate box that's associated with that arrow. So it's very straightforward. I won't give you anything that's not clearly identified as a part of the illustration. And that covers the material that will be on the examination for Exam 1, and I hope this review helps, and good luck studying. Thank you.